Hey everyone, VinhSon here from CreativeDejo.net. In today's video tutorial, we're going to be talking about the default lens flare in After Effects and how we can just spice things up a little bit and enhance the default lens flare so we can get the lens flare to the point where we can actually use it in our projects without feeling so embarrassed. And before we get started, I just wanted to say that this is actually a revival of another revival tutorial by Harry Frank, so many thanks to him. Some of the techniques used in this video tutorial was brought over and transferred from his tutorial, so many thanks to Harry Frank once again. But we are going to be adding on to this tutorial, and we're going to be adding some additional options like the flicker frequency and the flicker amount into our lens flare right here. So we just have a little more control over the lens flare, and we can control everything with the null control layer right here. So this is our default lens flare. Believe it or not, this is a default lens flare. And I'm in full resolution right now, and it renders fairly quickly. So we can move it around, all the elements kind of match up to it, everything works and just moves around with the lens flare correctly as it should, and renders fairly quickly for all the effects applied to it right now. And before we get started, this tutorial kind of uses some basic expressions in After Effects. Don't worry, you won't have to be writing a lot of this stuff. This is all just pick whipping and all that stuff, but we will be using a little bit of expressions. So if you're not comfortable with expressions, hopefully this tutorial is basic enough for you to follow along, as well as kind of dip your foot into some expressions in After Effects. Actually very, very simple to understand. So let's just get started in After Effects right here. Let's go ahead and create a new composition right here. And we're just going to name this lens flare enhanced and make it black, hit OK. So now we just have a blank composition right here. So I'm going to go create a new solid layer, Control Command Y, and I'm going to name this lens flare. Make comp size and make sure it's black so we can add or screen our lens flare in without any issues, so we can actually see our lens flare. And let's go to the effects and presets and bring in our default lens flare. And just bring that in. Now on the bat, you're probably thinking, well, this looks very, very ugly, especially compared to this one right here. And that is true. It's also an 8-bit plugin, so you're not going to have that nice 16, 32-bit color or anything like that. As well as it's a 2D effect, so we can't really move this lens flare into Z space or Z depth or anything like that. But this can be overcome by a few expressions covered in a later tutorial. So this is the default lens flare. We're going to learn how to spice this up a little bit. So right now I'm just going to put this lens flare center to the center of my composition, which is 640 by 360 for this 720p composition right here. And this kind of just makes things easier for the anchor point to be in the center. We want to make our anchor point at the center of our lens flare. So you're probably wondering, well, why even use this technique? Why go through all this trouble to create some lens flares when you can simply just use null light factory or optical flares? And it's actually very simple because a lot of people do not have null light factory or optical flares, or many people choose not to buy it because they don't use the lens flares in their daily workflow or their work on a daily basis. So there's really no point of buying optical flares. But say they got a client recently and that client wants some lens flares in their project. Some people prefer not to shell out a few $100 to buy a lens flare plugin that they'll only be using like once or twice. So just a little nice way. It's actually possible to get some pretty nice results, some pretty decent results from the default lens flare in After Effects. So the first thing we're going to do is create somewhat of a streak, so kind of like a anamorphic lens flare, but not really. Let's create a new solid layer. We're going to name this streak. We're going to make it comp size and make it white. Hit OK. So I'm just going to shut off the eyeball so we don't see this layer. I'm going to go to get the pen tool right here. I believe it's the G key. And I'm just going to turn the title safe of our little reference point. And what we want to do is kind of use the center as a reference point, kind of just draw a little dot above it. And then go around here and just click here. And then one down here. And then just mirror it to the left. So we kind of have this nice little really skinny diamond right here, and this is going to be our streak, our anamorphic streak. And we just turn on our layer again, you can see that we have this nice white little streak. So this is essentially how you create a nice anamorphic lens flare. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you guys next time. No, actually it looks very horrible, so let's go ahead and feather this thing out. Let's hit F on the keyboard to bring up the mask feather. And we're just going to feather it a little bit. A little quick tip, if you hit Control Shift H or Command Shift H, you can actually hide the layer, the guide layers, the mask guide layers, so we can kind of see our shape a little bit better, as you see here. So just feather it out a little bit so it's not so sharp. We're going to hit T on the keyboard to just bring down the opacity. a little bit. And then just toggle the switches / modes to bring up the transfer mode. And we're going to change the transfer mode to add. So it's going to add to our lens flare a little bit. So we kind of have this nice kind of blending of colors. So this is pretty much our anamorphic streak. Of course, you can always go back into the mask and tweak it yourself. Just click on the hit M, select the mask. Make sure your mask is on, and kind of just adjust these points to however you want. Something like that. I think that looks pretty nice. So you can go on and tweak as many things as you want. I'm going to create another streak just for the heck of it. Control Command D to duplicate it. We can just hit R on the keyboard and rotate it. So we kind of get this nice streak right here. And we can rotate it 90 degrees. And we can just scale this one down. So hit S and just scale it down a little bit. And have some fun with it, and maybe change the opacity of this one to maybe like 30%. And maybe change transfer mode from add to soft light. You know, whatever works. And of course, you can keep on doing this. Now, what we need is a little more sparkle in our lens flare. So let's create a new little sparkle right here. So we can actually make sure that no layers are selected, and we can actually create a nice star shape layer. So if you go up here, by default, you're probably going to see a rectangle right here. If you just click and hold, you can actually select the star tool right here. And just go to the center of your lens flare, hold down shift, and just kind of drag so you can create this nice little proportional star right here. And just kind of make it size appropriate, kind of as big as your iris. That's looking pretty good. So of course, we need to adjust this star because obviously this star is not looking it doesn't look quite right for our lens flare. And the great thing about shape layers is we can actually go into the shape and actually modify it. So right here you see the polystar number 1. Just go ahead and open that up. Go to polystar path number 1. And we can just play around with the number of points. So depending on how much spark you want, you can always adjust this parameter right here. I'm going to create a small one at first. Kind of like a nice glint. And then we can pull down the inner radius. So we kind of just have our sparkle right here. Click away, kind of have this nice sparkle. Of course, you can play around with the rest of the settings right here. They're all for you to play around with and mess around with. I'm going to decrease the opacity by quite a bit. Something like that. Maybe we can put it below our streaks. Maybe set this one to add as well. So we get something like that. We can duplicate the shape layer. Let's call the first one glint or sparkle. Let's call this one glint. And then just make some room, and we're just going to go in and just kind of tweak the settings, make it not the same as the first sparkle. So maybe rather than having, you know, just some tiny little sparkle, we can just create some big ones. Decrease the point number. Something like that. Maybe just increase the inner radius a little bit. And then increase the outer radius. So we just get some variation. You know, whatever you want. You can also colorize these things by going and applying a fill filter to it, but of course, focus on that a little bit later. So this is pretty much our default lens flare right here. Now, a lot of people don't usually use this kind of lens flare. We don't really, for some reason, a lot of designers don't prefer the 50 to 300 millimeter zoom lens flare. Everyone either uses the 105 millimeter prime or the 35 millimeter prime. So I guess it's because the first one looks kind of ugly, in my opinion. Kind of like the default Photoshop lens flare, kind of retro 90s style lens flare. But I'm gonna select the 105 millimeter prime. I kind of like that one a little better. So this is essentially our lens flare right here. But as you can see, if we move our lens flare around, nothing follows it. And this is where we're gonna do some expressions. So let's create a new null object for our control. Let's go to layer new null object. And this is kind of this is going to be kind of our placeholder, kind of our nothing layer that kind of controls everything. So let's hit enter on the keyboard and just rename this null object to control. And we're just going to apply a few slider controls to this thing first. Bring the slider control in and just kind of duplicate it a few times. And the first one is going to be brightness. The second one's going to be flicker frequency, then flicker amount, and then ray length. You'll see why in a second. So let's just ignore these for now. Let's go ahead and actually attach all of our objects to our lens flare first. So if we just go down to the toggle down the lens flare, drop down arrow, Go to Effects and go to Lens Flare. You can see we have all the parameters for our lens flare. So essentially what we want to do is we want to center all the positions of our lens flare elements to our flare center. So make sure that all your elements have an anchor point to the center of the lens flare. You can always change the anchor point by going to this tool up here and just kind of center up the anchor point so the anchor point is at the middle of the lens flare. And once you have all that set up, we're ready to kind of link things together. So I'm going to hit the asterisk key to maximize this little panel right here. So our first element is the streaks. So let's just hit P on the keyboard to bring up all the positions for all of our elements. And we're just going to hit Alt or Option. So click on Alt or Option, hold it down, and click on the stopwatch, and it's going to bring up the expression controls for the position parameter. And simply, we're just going to pick whip the position to our lens flare center. And do this for all the layers. So once again, hold Alt or Option, just pick up to the flare center, pick up to the flare center, and pick up to the flare center. So now, if we go ahead and move our lens flare around, our element should move around with it, and it does. So that's looking pretty great, but we're not controlling our lens flare with our control layer. So let's go ahead and set that up right now. So everything is hooked on to our lens flare center, but now we want to hook the lens flare center to our control position. So hit P on the keyboard for the control position, hit Alt or Option for the flare center, for the lens flare, and just pick up the flare center to the position of our null control. So now if we move our control, it moves the lens flare. So this is pretty cool as it is, but this is not very interesting. So the first thing I'm going to do is link up all the positions, and pretty much we want to control all of our lens flare elements, all of our lens flare effects in the control layer, and we have all these sliders to use. So I'm just going to close up all these layers first. And the first thing we want to do is make the brightness slider work. So the first thing we're going to do is toggle down the lens flare again, right here, and you see flare brightness. We want to attach all the elements to the flare brightness first. So let's hit T on the keyboard for all these other extra elements. So we have our opacity set right here. And then we're just gonna pick whip, so hold Alt or Option again, and pick whip the streak opacity to the flare brightness. But notice, if we do that, our opacity for the streak is gonna be 100. So whatever setting the flare brightness is, it's gonna apply that setting or this parameter value to the opacity of this streak. Now, as you can see here, we don't want our streak opacity to be 100. We want it to be 30. So let's just pick whip the opacity to the flare brightness. And if you click away, you can see that it's 100 because this parameter value matches this flare brightness value because they're parented. So if you go down to the expression right here, we can just do -70. You can see that now it's back to 30 again. So as you can see for this streak layer right here, the opacity is set to 64, and we want to maintain that number 64. So what we're going to do is pick whip this parameter to the flare brightness, except we're going to do -36, and that should keep our opacity number at 64. And it does. So just keep on doing this for the rest. Pick whip this to the flare brightness, -87. And -87. So now if we change the flare brightness parameter right here, it's also going to change the opacity of all the rest of the elements. So now we want to control the flare brightness to our control layer. So let's go ahead and toggle down the control. Go to effects. And this is our brightness slider. So toggle that open. So we're going to pick whip the flare brightness to the brightness slider. So now if I change the brightness slider, it's going to change the flare brightness, which is also going to change the rest of the opacity of the rest of the elements. So right now, there's no flare because our slider for the control is set to 0. If we set the brightness to 100, we have our flare back again. So now we can simply control the flare brightness using our brightness slider. So very cool indeed. So we're going to do this for the rest of the flare elements. Now the flicker frequency and the flicker amount can be a little bit tricky, so let's go into that right now. So I'm going to close the brightness slider. We're done with the brightness slider. It's all done now. We're going to go down to the flicker frequency and the flicker amount. So bring that up. So remember, the opacity of all of our elements is hooked on to the flare brightness. So we don't care about the opacity of these layers anymore. They're already done. They're already hooked onto our flare brightness. So how do we control the flickering amount for our lens flare? We can obviously play around with the flare brightness by using the wiggle expression. So find the flare brightness parameter right here. And let's bring up the expression control for it. So double click on the expression right here so we can just have some room to type some stuff. Make some room. Alright, so I'm going to add a nice semicolon after this because after every line of expression you need a semicolon. And they want to type in our wiggle expression. So we can wiggle or randomize the flickering. So we can go to wiggle. And usually we would type in a value. So wiggle parentheses 250. Now usually or always, the first number is the frequency or how often does it happen. And the second number is the amount or by how much. So usually we already have predefined numbers. We want it to occur 2 times a second by the amount of 50. Well, we do not want a predefined number. We want to be able to control these numbers easily with our sliders. So rather than having a predefined number, we can erase it and substitute this. So just pick whip to our flicker frequency slider. So rather than having a number for the frequency, we have our flicker frequency slider instead. So for the next value, the 50 right here, I'm going to erase it and just pick up that to the flicker amount. So now we can control the frequency with our frequency slider as well as the flicker amount by our flicker amount slider right here. And by default, it kind of just creates a nice parentheses for you and everything just works fine. So right now there's no flickering because our slider has no flickering. So I'm gonna just say make this 5. So it's gonna flicker 5 times. And the amount, let's just say, let's wiggle the opacity by 30. So now our lens flare changes, and if you do a RAM preview, you can see that we added a nice flickering feature or option to our lens flare. So pretty easy to do with some basic expression. So the lens flare is looking okay, but things look kind of too sharp still, and we can apply a nice lens blur to this, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to apply a nice shine to this. You can use CC light ray, I believe, CC light burst or CC radial fast blur. So let's create a new adjustment layer. And we can just call this one shine. And I'm using shine because I have it and it's a lot faster to render. And I'm sure everyone has shine. I mean, it doesn't matter who you are, if you're a visual effects artist or motion graphics designer, most people have the Trapcode suite in their possession. If not, just use CC radial fast blur. So drag and shine, and by default it looks kind of crazy right here. We want to set the transfer mode from normal or none to add. Alright, so we have shine and everything looks kind of neat. So notice how if I move our lens flare, the shine doesn't really follow our lens flare appropriately. It kind of just shines to the center. And that's because the center of shine is not matching with our center lens flare. And we can easily fix that. So I'm just going to reset it. And let's go to shine, toggle down shine, toggle down the effects, toggle down shine again. And you see that we have the source point, the center point of our shine. So we need to match that up with our default flare center. So pretty simple, just pick whip the source point of shine to our flare center. And now everything should match up just fine if we move our control layer. Alright, that's great, but we still have one more slider to fix up, and that is the ray length. So simply just toggle down the controls, go down to the ray length slider, and just parent the shine ray length to that slider right there. So open up shine, find the ray length, and just pick whip to the ray length slider. So now we can control our ray length using the slider. So there's no ray length right now. It actually looks pretty nice. You can actually use shine to colorize and color correct and color grade your lens flares and pretty much anything else without having any shine. So, you know, shine's a pretty interesting little plugin. You can color correct with it. Get some pretty nice results. Let's just make the ray length 5. Maybe even 3. So we kind of have this nice little lens flare going on right here. And of course, you can add some color control to this. So if you don't want to change the colorize option in shine, you can always apply color checkboxes. Let's go to color under, I believe, expression controls. Yes, color control. Bring that in, make 3 of them. Call this one highlight, this one midtones, and this one shadows. And simply just hook those on to shine's color. So we're gonna expand this. It gets kind of messy when you're working with a lot of expressions and parenting. So let's bring up the highlights, midtones, shadows, and just bring up the colorize for shine as well. So we're gonna parent the shadows to the shadow slider or shadow color. Pick with the midtones to the midtones color. And we're gonna parent the highlights to the highlight color. So now our flare should be all red because of our colors right here. So click on your control and let's just make this one, let's make it a blue lens flare. Mid-tone little blue. And the highlight should be around white or so. And we can just decrease the. Now, of course, now the streak looks kind of funny now, so we can always go back and adjust the mask. So don't feel restricted about the tweaking. You can always add more irises, you can add more polygons, you can create some nice bokeh, you know, lens elements, grimes, more irises, as I said before, and, you know, add more streaks. This is just a basic lens flare mockup. Of course, you can always enhance and add more elements to your lens flare and just parent them to our control or our lens flare. So pretty simple. We pretty much covered the basic expressions a little bit, so you can get your foot wet with expressions. We added some nice flickering to our lens flare, and we all added the control. So now we can control everything from position to flicker to brightness, all with our lens flare control null object. So pretty useful. Don't forget that you can change the lens flare type to maybe the second one. See how that looks. Kind of gives you a different anamorphic look. And please do not forget to color correct. You do not have to make all these elements white. You can always color correct these things to be purple, blue, green, you know, whatever you want. So make sure you color correct. Make sure you add more elements. Make sure you kind of randomize these things a little bit. And don't forget to play around with this because this is all experimental. Hopefully this is good enough for your project, and hopefully you can actually make the default lens flare in After Effects a little more useful. And don't forget to thank Harry Frank for some of the techniques shown in this video tutorial. Many thanks to Harry Frank. Thank you for watching, guys. My name is VinhSon from Creative Dojo. If you want to see more tutorials, visit creativedojo.net for more tutorials. And if you like this tutorial, leave your feedback comments down below. If you have any questions, leave your feedback comments down below. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video tutorial. Bye.